economically, it could overwhelm, militarily overwhelm, etc. Then China kind of deployed this charm offensive on Southeast Asia, doing this, uh, the doing aid, and now with the Belt and Road. But of course, at the same time, using the South China Sea as a divider between claimant countries to the South China Sea and non-claimant countries um, in ASEAN. So, what are China's intentions? Are they good or bad? Are they more complicated than good and bad? We don't know. And it's really this idea that what I'm trying to answer is, does Chinese assistance, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, impact governance, specifically democracy in Cambodia? If so, how? This is kind of the question, and the um, the explanatory variable is Chinese assistance, um, and the dependent variable, what I'm trying to explain, is governance, democracy, whether that gets worse as a result. Of course, the problem is that correlation is not causation. Just because two things happen at the same time does not mean one causes the other. Just because you see a fire truck at every site of a fire doesn't mean a fire truck is causing the fire. Um, and that's true in the sense that Chinese assistance could be increasing to countries that just happen to become less democratic or more corrupt, while that Chinese assistance is increasing. And that Chinese assistance has nothing to do with democracy or corruption uh, changing. And that's a point that Ren Xiao of Fudan University has made personally to me in workshops we've had at the University of Michigan Ford School. And look, I'm happy to elaborate on the dependent and independent variables and so on, but it's essentially the idea here is that we have to avoid selecting on the dependent variable. We have to avoid trying to choose cases that explain the outcome in a way that seals the causal mechanism, even though it excludes other possible explanations. That's why in your papers I asked for an alternative explanation. So the logic basically is, and I think I've talked about it in other classes, but if you think, for example, that authoritarian regimes are the key to economic growth, and you look only at authoritarian regimes and you determine that, oh my God, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, they all had authoritarian leaders that ended up, you know, coinciding with high levels of economic growth. Does that mean that one caused the other? Well, if that's all you looked at, that's what you might conclude. But you could also look at cases where there were also authoritarian leaders who caused terrible economic outcomes. Marcos in the Philippines, and just about everybody else in Pakistan that's led the country, right? So you can have that in Egypt. So it's like studying the lottery. The metaphor is studying the lottery, but only looking at the winners of the lottery, never looking or interviewing the losers, people who played the lottery and didn't end up winning. And if you only studied the winners, you might conclude that playing the lottery always means that you win. But that would be wrong, obviously, because that's most people don't win. So that's the idea. So is and to frame this work in the context of other literature, you think about how Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history. Is this the new end of history? He wrote, for example, what we may be witnessing, this is in 1989 or 91, I can't remember, is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Now, it sounds like he's figured out that is the ultimate uh, goal or end of human government evolution. But he does, to his credit, argue that despite the long-term march towards democracy, there would be temporary setbacks which could last centuries. Right now, we've seen the spread of authoritarianism, populism, and Norris and Engelhardt have argued in Cultural Backlash, Trump, Brexit, and the Rise of Authoritarianism, populism, that that's exactly what we're seeing now. That Trump, Brexit, and so on, they're just reactions to globalization. Are we experiencing a temporary or a permanent setback in democracy globally? And that's really the essence of it. If you look at the state of democracy globally, you wouldn't necessarily conclude that things have been bad. Population of the world living in democracy seems to have increased over time, certainly, coinciding with increased human rights and freedom. But it's not so clear when you look at recent years. Things don't look so great for freedom now. You have a situation in which more countries of late have seen declines in freedom. For example, in 2017, 71 saw declines in freedom versus 35 saw improvements in freedom. So more countries seem to now be suffering setbacks in freedom. And anecdotally, you can see that with Turkey's Erdogan here talking with Putin's Russia, Russia's Putin rather, and Erdogan at a Turkish embassy event in Washington D.C. had some of his goons there who beat up protesters. This is on U.S. soil that this is happening, and injured them. And two were arrested, but it seems they're going to get away overall. You've got Mubarak in Egypt, who recently finally passed away, and you've got al-Sisi now taking over, another general. You've got Duterte in the Philippines, who said that he might have killed somebody as a teenager, doesn't quite remember, he says all kinds of crazy things. You have the former general, now Prime Minister of Thailand, here shaking hands with Wang Yi, Foreign Minister of China. Oh, and by the way, Thailand, of course, has had its share of coups. The current one is technically now that it's a democracy, even though it took 6 attempts to hold elections, and then this last election, it took weeks for them to actually announce the results. It seems they were just cooking numbers in the meantime. But again, I could be selecting on the dependent variable. There are some success cases, Taiwan being one of them. And until recently, there was also Malaysia, where Mahathir won against the ruling party. Of course, he was part of the ruling party for many decades and then switched sides. But of course, now, as of March 1st, the party that he beat, the then ruling party, has now returned to power, and so things are now looking not so good. But at its core, this is a story about the golden rule. And what is the golden rule? He who has the gold makes the rules. And in essence, it is about following where that gold is located. Here, the Prime Minister of Cambodia holding a press conference in which he mocks the journalists for wearing masks, saying that he'll kick them out because they're wearing masks. No one is allowed to wear masks in his press conference. Well, the tune has since changed. He went to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping. He was trying to kiss the ring, make sure that his loyalty was rewarded, and he was. She said that a friend in need is a friend indeed to Hun Sen. When the Holland America Westerdam cruise ship could not dock after 5 attempts at different ports, Hun Sen offered Cambodia as a country where the Westerdam could dock. Now, he believed that no one on the ship had COVID-19. The ship told him that. course, turned out it wasn't accurate. Somebody did have it, and even as he was promoting tours of Cambodia to the passengers who had disembarked, and along with massages and so on, this led to subsequent calls for further examination of the situation in Cambodia. I mean, he was there with roses in hand, handing out to the passengers, along with handshakes with the passengers and hugs and so on. They were so happy. Um, Anyways, let's start where the real money is, and that is when your boss calls a meeting during a soon-to-be pandemic. Actually, we know that it's a pandemic, and that was in Laos, where in February, China called a meeting of ASEAN and had occasion to do that. Now, how things are different now. This was in February. In April, about a week ago, that was the next meeting, and it had to take place over video conference. There it was. There they are, basically the heads of state of each of the ASEAN member countries. Oh, and by the way, please feel free to interrupt me in the middle of my presentation if something's not clear, if you have some question or anything like that. I'm happy to answer. I don't want to wait until the the end of my presentation to do the Q&A necessarily. But this is in April. They're finally following social distancing rules. And in Cambodia, they've really taken the opportunity to take advantage of the situation where it's now all about passing laws like the state of emergency law, which was rubber stamped last Friday by the Cambodian Senate, and includes things like surveillance of all communications in Cambodia. Now, why would you need to surveil communications in Cambodia during COVID-19? Does that make any sense at all? Or, for example, further or future declarations of states of emergency under the pretext of severe chaos to national security and social order, which I would argue basically means whatever those in power decide displeases them. So you can hear my pontifications on BBC NewsHour if you want to. So anyways, all seriousness here, going forward, Trump called a meeting of ASEAN leaders in Vegas in March, on March 14th. There was confusion as to why he wanted it to happen in Vegas, aside from probably using his hotel there. But it turns out that there was also going to be another meeting of supporters of Trump, led by Sheldon Adelson, who would spend $100 million for his reelection. So there was a reason why he wanted to be in Vegas at that time. He wanted to actually do that meeting and meet the ASEAN leaders, because the ASEAN leaders knew better and knew that it was going to be canceled. But we know that that one of the first things Trump did was to withdraw the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in January 2017 when he assumed office. And the TPP obviously was about to create a free trade zone for these countries. Now, without the U.S., the biggest lion's share of trade would be gone, and the value of that TPP would be far less as a result. Overall, U.S. trade with the Pacific region is 60% of all U.S. trade. There are Asian and maritime and regional security concerns that are vital to the U.S. Asian Americans are 6% of the U.S. population. They're the fastest growing ethnic group. Asians dominate the vast number of foreign students in America. Moreover, you just look at the geoeconomic context. You have Southeast Asia, for example, a region of 600 plus million, 2 trillion in GDP, 3,500 in per capita GDP. You've got China with 1.3 billion people, 10 trillion, that's in 2014, GDP 7,000, twice Southeast Asia's per capita GDP. So really a lot of economic opportunity there. You also have to look closer. Within Southeast Asia, the ethnic Chinese hold on the economy is somewhat staggering. Thailand, 81% of the Thai economy is held by ethnic Chinese. That doesn't mean that they're Chinese from Beijing. It just means that they're ethnic Chinese. 99% in Laos, 92% in Cambodia, 62% in the Philippines, 63% in Malaysia. Singapore, well, place is run by ethnic Chinese anyway, so it isn't surprising that it's 96%. Actually, it's surprising that it's only 96%, perhaps. It is China's game overall, and China has been sending military personnel to meet with Cambodian personnel and military personnel in Cambodia and holding meetings in China, high-level meetings, to essentially cultivate that relationship between the two countries. And that has led to military exercises, even during COVID-19, when 3,000 Chinese troops were in Cambodia. Um, while the Cambodian authorities called on the border to be closed to foreigners, they still allowed the exercises to continue. That was baffling, to say the least. But I think it's demonstrations like these where the military personnel right at the Independence Monument of Cambodia show how close the relationship between China and Cambodia really is. There has been a long time Chinese presence in Cambodia. I mean, you can go back actually to the 12th century when there were visitors from China who chronicled the uh, the Angkorian Empire, the Khmer Empire. Um, but more recently, even in the 1970s, there was Chinese communist technical assistance to the Khmer Rouge, and they were like brothers in arms, advising Pol Pot. There have been waves of investments from the garment industry to energy, mining, agriculture, to hydroelectric, and now, of course, to the Belt and Road Initiative through development finance and soft loans. China is going global. Um, One Belt, One Road, or Belt and Road Initiative is a $1 trillion planned investment ranging from ports in Pakistan and Sri Lanka to high-speed railways in East Africa to gas pipelines crossing Central Asia. The interesting thing is that a lot of it is announced, only some of it is signed, and even less of it actually materializes. So a lot of this can still be very ephemeral. But it isn't just confined to the Silk Road or those parts that we know of. I mean, it goes all the way to New Zealand. So here you're not seeing New Zealand, but what you do see is, interestingly enough, India having almost nothing except for something there in Calcutta. But it is clear if you look closer that there's the encirclement of India happening. So the port of Gwadar in Pakistan is unprofitable. The port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka is also unprofitable. The Kakong New Port is also unprofitable. Um, all Chinese investments. And why? Well, if you want to be around encircling India, whom you think will be your next competitor in this century, you would want to be ready for that. And India clearly is going to be down the road the competitor to China. The U.S. doesn't have the population. I mean, of course you know, we're still number one, but it's clear that if you were to look down the road further, this could become the Indian century. The sources of aid for Cambodia from China have increased over time. Now, these are official aid numbers, and so China doesn't really use official aid that much. It uses something called other official flows, OOFs. And it's basically aid-like, but it's not concessional, or it has a commercial component that means that they're actually trying to make money from it. And most of the China's aid comes out of its Ministry of Commerce. Um, Here you have it a little bit more clearly in terms of when China replaced Japan as the biggest donor to Cambodia. And I've got a couple of videos to share here about how China tries to explain the Belt and Road Initiative uh, to Westerners through song. So let me put that on, and hopefully we'll be able to see that. Oh, I see more. Okay, no, that's a lot of open tabs. Okay, it's still Stephanie's last message. There's nothing new.
맞습니다.
Okay, Stephanie, I'm hearing you. I'm hearing all of that Korean talk.
That's sorry. I thought I wasn't
Yeah,
aware I
you
was in
weren't
the
on mute.
call.
No worries, no worries, no worries. All right, let's see. We have got a little song and dance thing going on.
The belt connects to land, the road moves on the sea. The promise that they hold is joint prosperity. We're breaking barriers, we're making history. The war we're dreaming of starts with you and me. The future's coming out. The belt and road is how we share the goodness now. The belt and road is how. When traders open up, that's when the sharing starts. Resources changing hands and shipping autobots. Ideas start to flow and friendships start to form. Then seems impossible. All becomes the norm. The future's coming now. The belt and road is how we share the goodness now. The belt and road is how. Products and goods are only a part. From apples to cranes, they're state of the art. We're paving new roads, building more ports, finding new options with friends of all sorts. The culture exchange, we trade in our wealth. We connect with our hearts to strengthen our health. With our lines and our cables, diplomacy tables, we share in a world of prosperity. Oh! The future's coming now. The belt and road is how we share the goodness now. The belt and road is how. 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 The belt and road is how.
So a cute little song. I should probably find somebody's twisted version of that. But that's not the only thing that, of course, China has done to promote the idea of the Belt and Road. There's also the What's the Belt and Road Initiative bedtime stories, just in case one needs more childlike explanation of what the BRI is. Let me put that on.
Time for bed, sweetie.
Okay, Papa.
Now, Bob's gonna be gone a few days this month, and I'll miss you.
Why?
I'm going to attend a forum in Beijing on the Belt and Road Initiative.
What's that?
Okay. Once upon a time, several routes led from China through Central Asia to Europe. It was called Silk Road. People would put things on camels and cross the desert to trade with other people.
Like country sharing?
Yeah, and then later, ships traveled from China through Southeast Asia to Africa. And they'd bring things back to China like giraffes.
Is that how the Beijing Zoo got drafts?
No, that was a long time ago.
What's that have to do with the forum?
Well, a few years ago, China's President Xi Jinping proposed making new routes like the old routes, but even bigger. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative. More stuff can move around the world more easily, and people can travel more easily and build things countries need.
That's good, Papa.
So this forum is a chance to tell the world about the Belt and Road, like I'm telling you. Lots of countries' leaders will be there. They'll talk, and we'll learn more about its future.
About how countries will use camels to carry stuff?
No, they're building new things, like highways and railways and airports, and even pipelines and internet cables.
So it's just about moving stuff around?
That's a big part of it, but there's a lot more.
What else?
I'll tell you tomorrow, sweetie, okay? It's time for you to go to sleep. Love you.
Good night.
Good night.
Yes. Yes, there's a lot more, as we'll discover. And actually, it's interesting. I mean, it's not just infrastructure. It's not just hard infrastructure. It's also soft or human capital. So, scholarships for thousands of students from Cambodia to go to China and study. These kinds of things are immeasurable. I mean, imagine a Fulbright program, but not for 5 Cambodians per year, which is really how many that get it, but for 500, 5,000. It could be incredibly transformative in that sense. There's a comment here. Justin Sell has sent a video.
So
Uh,
that was that's a spoof that John Oliver made of the video you just
oh,
showed us.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll have to, download the video file and upload it back to Blue Jeans to actually make it play properly. But we can enjoy it uh, on our last class. So yeah, so there you have it. I mean, these are the kinds of things that one tries to explain how $1 trillion can get spent, and how much of a difference that can make. Actually, I'm going to try to download it now and see whether I can still squeeze it in before the end of class today. But I have to multitask as a result. Um, all right, let me return to my slides and and go back to PowerPoint here and skip over to this. Okay, let me see if I have not been able yet to open the file, the YouTube video, but all right, play from current slide. So it is what I say is a win-win-win-win for China. And that's because China has excess capital that it wants to invest and make money from. And when it does, through the means of a loan to the country, it requires that to be a no tender or tendered to Chinese firms only process. In turn, those Chinese firms employ Chinese workers who happen to be overwhelmingly men in a country that has seen infanticide of girls, and therefore has 3 million missing girls, women, where the men then can't find spouses. So maybe if they stay in those countries, they can find a local spouse. If things go wrong in terms of unprofitability, they can do a debt equity swap. What does that mean? It means that I gave you a loan to build this port. Now you can't pay me back the loan. So I'm just going to take over the port for 99 years as the owner of the port. That's what happened in Sri Lanka. And it is the 99-year lease that they signed over. So this is Hambantota Port Concession Agreement, in which the Sri Lankans hand over the port. And there's the big, fat, lottery-looking $292 million check that the Sri Lankan port authorities got. Now, I know you're surprised probably to see Mike Pence's face here, but he did say, in fact, China uses so-called debt diplomacy to expand its influence. Today, that country is offering hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure loans to governments from Asia to Africa to Europe and even Latin America. Yet the terms of those loans are opaque at best, and the benefits invariably flow overwhelmingly to Beijing. Just ask Sri Lanka, which took on massive debt to let Chinese state companies build a port of questionable commercial value. 2 years ago, that country could no longer afford its payments, so Beijing pressured Sri Lanka to deliver the new port directly into Chinese hands. It may soon become a forward military base for China's growing blue water navy. So, summing up essentially some of these dilemmas of countries that have to deal with that. Now, Sri Lanka happens to also be home to the world's emptiest airport. Of course, it is no longer the world's emptiest airport, given that virtually every airport in the world is now empty. But even before COVID-19, uh, this airport of 10,000 square meter was seeing something like 1 to 2 flights a week, which was remarkably inefficient in terms of number of flights. Um, And it's not just roads, bridges, empty airports. It's also private investment in high rises, condos, and 150 casinos, more than Vegas and Macau combined. Now, I should be clear, these are not Belt and Road Initiative casinos. There are no casinos in Belt and Road, but these are the kinds of investments that are attracted when there is, the targeting of Belt and Road on a country. So if Belt and Road is operating in Cambodia and says, this is a great place, come and make money here. And who needs 150 casinos in Cambodia, right? I mean, in one city, Sihanoukville in Cambodia, it's a beach city that I used to enjoy tremendously. Um, there are 156 hotels, of which 150 are Chinese owned, 436 restaurants, of which 414 are Chinese owned, 62 casinos, of which 48 are Chinese owned, along with 41 Chinese owned karaoke clubs and 46 Chinese owned massage parlors. One would have to wonder how many massage parlors are needed in a place like Sihanoukville, not that big of a place really, but seriously. Diamond Island, Cambodia, a artificial island off of Phnom Penh, has seen the construction of high-rises, condominiums, like this structure here called the Bridge, which seems to be intended to essentially be investment vehicles for Chinese nationals who are from some obscure village with apparently tons of money. They don't actually live there, they just own. And so it's created a problem that Cambodia hasn't had before, which is all these ghost cities that don't make any sense. So, in other words, we're ending up with the same problem that China also has, which is that these ghost cities are units snapped up and left empty, driving up real estate prices. And it's Xi Jinping himself who said houses are built to be inhabited, not for speculation. So, if one goes by the logic of Xi, there should be far less speculation going on in Cambodia. He also said in February 2009, while in Mexico, before he became the head of China, when he was still vice president, quote, "There are few foreigners with full bellies who have nothing better to do than try to point fingers at our country. China does not export revolution, hunger, poverty, nor does China cause you any headaches. Just what else do you want?" Now, obviously, there are some folks who would disagree with that given COVID-19. But at the time, he was referring to the export of revolution. And I found that to be very interesting because revolution seems to be a theme that runs in the narrative of Cambodia in terms of color revolutions. Basically, Cambodia keeps saying that color revolutions are being imposed by the West on Cambodia. And I think this is something that rings a bell for Xi Jinping when he hears the Cambodian Prime Minister talk about color revolution. This is a problem for us. Why do we have to suffer this Western interference with revolutions that are being created in our country? I think it's very telling that that you would have a situation of this nature in a place like Cambodia. And then, years earlier, Xi Jinping was using that kind of argument. There's soft power by China. Soft power is, to influence by persuasion rather than coercion. And Joe Nye at the Kennedy School originally defined it as excluding investment and aid and formal diplomacy, but it actually now pretty much includes that as well. And you can have high or low targeted at the broader public, maybe, Gangnam Style by Psy or some kind of K-pop phenomenon that brings you closer to another culture as a result. Hollywood was a classic example. You also have smart power, and of course you have hard power, which is pointing a gun at somebody, pointing your military, your missiles and other things. Cambodia was host and remains host of this school here, which was for a long time the largest Chinese language school outside of China. And I think part of the idea here is that, why would China invest in a place like Cambodia? Well, there are reasons for that. There are financial advantages that are present in in uh, in Cambodia in terms of that relationship. And remember, 96% or 92% or something like that ethnic Chinese hold on the economy. All right. In 1999, the Cambodian Senate complex was built, courtesy of China. Remains a functioning establishment with its own golf range in the back, and that was because there was an election in '98, and then they couldn't figure out what to do with some politicians, so they created a Senate, and so the Chinese built that complex. And then a decade later, they built the Council of Ministers building over the site of the old Council of Ministers building. And in the center there, you'll see there's a pyramid-looking tomb-like structure, which was to be the Prime Minister's office. But then he decided, by consulting feng shui masters, that this was not the right place for him to hold his office. And so he had another building built, also with Chinese workers, next to it, in which he actually holds it. He calls it the Peace Palace. What did Cambodia do for China as a result? I mean, it's interesting. December of 2009, 20 Uyghurs ended up in Cambodia. They wanted to get to another country. They wanted to get asylum elsewhere. They needed to be recognized as refugees. Cambodia has a long history with having hundreds of thousands of its people being refugees. So why wouldn't Cambodia see the light on that? Well, the day before Xi Jinping came to sign $1.2 billion worth of deals, Cambodia packed the 20 Uyghurs in a chartered plane and sent them to China, where they have not since been heard from again. There was a punishment for doing that. The U.S. was going to give 200 trucks and trailers, surplus equipment to Cambodia. That was canceled. But I think it's very telling what the Cambodian spokesperson said at that time. Quote, "If the U.S. gives us the equipment, we are happy. And if they won't give it to us, it is also good." So clearly didn't care about it. But it's not just China calling the shots. Cambodia is making threats beyond its borders. Prime Minister's claimed that he only needs 7 hours to find anyone on Facebook within Cambodia's borders to arrest them for saying something he doesn't like. And one example is this gentleman here, Sanrata, 29-year-old, who was sent to pretrial detention for writing on Facebook that the government of Cambodia was authoritarian, which I would argue is irony defined, in that you call the government authoritarian and they arrest you. So that's fascinating. And more recently with COVID-19, the journalist who quoted the prime minister saying that motor taxi drivers who are going bankrupt can just sell their motorbike and use the money from the sale to spend. That the government doesn't have any money to help them. He was quoted as saying that. The journalist was arrested for quoting the prime minister for saying that, which by logic would suggest that if the journalist is guilty of incitement, as they imply by quoting the prime minister, then the prime minister, having said that, should be even more guilty as a result of having said the original words. But Hun Sen has said so many outrageous things over the years. Here he was going to Australia and people were protesting, so he said he'd send people to beat up protesters in Australia, Australian Cambodians. He has a kind of grand view of himself, and that's certainly not unique in these types of leaders. ASEAN, of course, is the body that represents 10 ASEAN countries regionally. And he said, ASEAN without Hun Sen is not ASEAN. He said, I'll just give the reason that I'm busy with the election. Hun Sen can veto a joint statement between ASEAN and Australia. If you do something improper, Cambodia alone can make the statement get stuck. I would like to send a message in advance that if Cambodia does not agree, it means the statement will be impossible. So clearly sending that message that in the third person, speaking of himself, that it's not possible to go forward without him. But China's logic goes beyond ASEAN and Southeast Asia. In Timor-Leste, East Timor, you have a strong presence of China as well. This is half of an island on which here you see the then Chinese embassy. The U.S. embassy compound occupies the former Portuguese governor's compound. I used to play tennis right over here. Um, and here the Chinese have built the Ministry of Foreign Affairs building for Timor. Here it is finished, and as well the presidential palace. And why would China be interested in a place like East Timor? It's got, natural gas and oil resources in the Timor Gap. That area here is some of the deepest waters in the world. You can operate submarines completely undetected there. Democracy is in global retreat, I would argue. There, in Cambodia, seeing opposition dissolved, leaders jailed and exiled in Thailand, Cambodia, and elsewhere. Facebook posts leading to arrest. Philippines, the president says he killed somebody as a teenager. Thailand, after 6 attempts at an election, it is finally held, but the opposition party is dissolved, and another's leader stands accused of sedition. In China, meanwhile, Xi Jinping has abolished term limits, which had been in practice for decades. So is he going to be the leader forever as a result? You see that sensitivities run high even for Winnie the Pooh, who is believed to be mocking the rotund appearance of Xi Jinping and therefore cannot be allowed. As for Cambodia, it appears to be increasingly a province of China, a wholly owned subsidiary. I know I sound alarmist, but I'm really not being alarmist. It's really something different about this particular relationship. The Director of National Intelligence for the U.S., Daniel Coates, who is no longer DNI, said in testimony in January 2019, Cambodia's slide towards autocracy, which culminated in the Cambodian People's Party retention of powers and complete dominance of the national legislature, opens the way for a constitutional amendment that could lead to a Chinese military presence in the country. What is he talking about? He's talking about this project in Kharkong, this Kharkong new port, in which there are suspicions. This is Dara Sakor by Union Development Group, Chinese group associated with the People's Liberation Army, and they're building an airfield that is so long, it's longer than any other airfield in Cambodia. It's 3,400 meters, 3.4 kilometers long. It's longer than the one at Phnom Penh International Airport, the main airport in Cambodia. It can accommodate any plane in the Chinese Air Force. And so the question is, why would they need this? It also happens to have a tight corner turn, perfect for jet fighters, or fighter jets rather. The Chinese see commercial ports as a foot in the door for their navy anyway. Any deep water commercial port can be used for naval ships. It's also going to host a deep water port, and it has a dual purpose there when you need it. Quoting myself there, Hun Sen shaking Xi's hand there, holding the governance of China by Xi Jinping translated into Cambodian, using it as a kind of Bible for his cabinet. This was Hun Sen's right-hand man holding an English language version of the book. It reminds of a little red book that Chairman Mao used to promote. And, that relationship between Wang Yi and Hun Sen and these hugs that are sometimes outrageous. This one's between Hun Sen and Ochoa of Thailand is really quite interesting. I mean, a little bit of information is good, but when it comes to the Prime Minister's diarrhea this morning, it's a little too much, frankly, to be sharing online in terms of radical transparency. Cambodian democracy has been gutted. I don't care if the argument is there was never democracy to begin with, so nothing was destroyed. Of this, I am certain. Cambodians are less free to speak today than they were a year ago, 2 years ago, and maybe even 2 decades ago. You might call it revisionist history, but I would argue this is why there's a need for more scholarship on Cambodia now, more so than ever. You've got here 3 pictures of assassinated individuals: the labor leader Chia Vichia, the environmentalist Chut Witi, the political analyst Kem Lay, all killed by gunshot. The Cambodians have a saying, "Bas bat," which means broken courage, and I think the ruling party has been very capable of choosing whoever is sort of sticking his neck out and becoming a little too noisy, a little too popular, and making sure that they are terminated. Um, Prime Minister of Cambodia said, "Let us solve our problems ourselves" at the World Economic Forum meeting not too long ago. Meanwhile, the opposition leader, Sam Rainsy, can't get home. He was stuck in Malaysia and then Indonesia and had to return to France. The other opposition leader was was jailed for a year under house arrest for another year, then released, but can't engage in politics or leave Cambodia and is now on trial. Hun Sen's tactic has always been to divide and conquer, and there's a cartoon from an old friend of mine who's very good at drawing political satire here. You see essentially the two then opposition parties, the Sam Rainsy Party and the Human Rights Party, and Hun Sen's sort of tactic has always been to have them fight each other, and he stepped on another chicken there, Fun Sin Pek, the Royalist Party, which he's already destroyed. Um, Here, a vice president of the opposition party, Musa Kur, who is a U.S. citizen, stuck in Malaysia as well, can't get home. Um, the government has published white papers titled "To Tell the Truth," where they try to revise history, reinterpret the past. They've kicked out the National Democratic Institute, a U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, a nonprofit. They've shuttered Radio Free Asia, which would broadcast independent news into Cambodia. They have shuttered the Cambodia Daily, basically the New York Times equivalent of Cambodia, English language, independent. And the Phnom Penh Post, which was the other independent newspaper, was captured by the authorities, purchased essentially when it was presented a tax bill it could not pay. The National Assembly of Cambodia voted after the dissolution by the Supreme Court of Cambodia of the opposition party to reallocate the seats of that opposition party to Fun Sin Pek, the Royalist Party that Hun Sen essentially had already captured and controlled. So a party that won less than 4% or 3.66% of the vote received the seats of a party that won 44.46% of the votes. Fascinating that one could do something like that. I didn't think that was possible. You would just call a new election. Why would you do that? But then they did have a new election, and of course, without the opposition party, the ruling party took all 125 seats. I guess they got greedy and figured, why not take it all? Here, Kem Lay, the political analyst, was speaking to Radio Free Asia before his assassination, days before his assassination, about a Global Witness report titled "Hostile Takeover: How Cambodia's Ruling Family Are Pulling the Strings on the Economy and Amassing Vast Personal Fortunes with Extreme Consequences for the Population." Killed at a convenience store at a gas station, shot. Now, there is bad news for Cambodia or for the regime in that the preferential trade agreement of the European Union, everything but arms, has been suspended, or 20% of it was suspended, which is valued at about 1 billion euros worth of exports. So now that 1 billion euros worth of exports from Cambodia to the EU will be taxed or will have tariffs imposed on it instead of being tariff-free. The U.S. has done its own global Magnitsky human rights designations on 4 Cambodians / entities. This means they can't bank with virtually any bank because banking involves U.S. dollars, and they're not allowed to really wire in that currency. They can't own U.S. property, things like that. Of course, they're smart enough not to own U.S. property. The Council of Ministers under Hun Sen drafted a white paper that was 132 pages long in Khmer, talking about color revolution, which I'll remind you is what Xi Jinping talked about in terms of exporting revolution. I would argue that this is a narrative that has long been an undercurrent in which the notion basically is that the West has been somehow fomenting revolution in countries like Cambodia and trying to remove its leaders. But, it could be basically you want to have democracy, and therefore it's considered too dangerous. You're causing color revolution. It's a threat to the existing regime. In the preamble to that report, the white paper, Hun Sen actually has this to say, and I find it very full of irony, to say the least. He says, real democracy in Cambodia has not been set back or fallen. Instead, it has been protected and strengthened in accordance with the principle of the rule of law. For the great benefit of the people and nation, only fake democracy has been abolished. And I would say this is really, I think, the height of irony in terms of reversing everything, turning white into black, black into white, good into bad, bad into good. And that is an art form. Really, that's ninja level uh, uh, mastery at this point. Anyways, it's words that remind me vaguely of this one time when Hun Sen kicked a soccer ball into a cameraman. And if you can see the GIF, it should eventually show you exactly where the poor fellow got hit. But that is unfortunately the reality in Cambodia these days. It is not a pretty reality, but that is where we are. So I'll stop there, take questions. I did manage through all of this um, to uh, to upload the video that Justin shared. So we could also watch that version of it from John, courtesy of John Oliver. But I want to open it up and just let folks talk, ask questions, make comments. Lee, you said, "Oh my God, this sounds 100% like she." Uh, I would love to hear more about that.
Like the way he talks about like color revolution sounds really, really familiar, and I mean, like he just literally sounds like an official from Chinese government because those like strict are always like how Chinese government officials say, you know.
Yeah. No, so it seems like there's a playbook that's being used, right? It's some kind of playbook that they're learning from. I mean, I don't know who,
Yeah,
when the student is ready, the teacher will appear, and now the student has become the teacher, and Hun Sen, I think, has become really, like I say, this ninja level mastery of this talk of color revolution. It's fascinating. Um, but I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I think it's, you don't know. It's like wag the dog. You can't tell who's feeding what to whom. Somebody is controlling this, but maybe the Cambodians are taking a clue from the Chinese, or they're just using each other's playbooks and helping one another through this process of defeating the West, I suppose. Any other comments, whether from you, Lee, or from anybody else? Questions? Should I show Justin's video? I think we'll just enjoy Justin's video and see if the irony of all of this. Hopefully, now I didn't check this, Justin. I really hope it's good humor here, right?
China's expanding now, it's growing big and strong. Let's learn about it now in this annoying song. They have a president, some call him Uncle Xi, but he can fuck with you instead of democracy. His name is China Xi, oh, doesn't want you to see, oh, he'd rather steal from you, oh, the shitty things they do, oh.
Compare him to this, and he will get pissed. You'll end up on an untrustworthy list. But failing his spells can't alter what's true. A man sees it painless like Winnie the Pooh.
This is the China Sea, oh, doesn't want you to see, oh, and that's the reason why, oh, you'd better watch the sky,
Oh, that was
I should say that
brilliant.
That
Yes.
came at the very end of like a 20-minute long segment of him breaking
But that
down
was
everything.
brilliant. That was brilliant. That's like on the level of Trey Parker and was Matt whatnot, the South Park creators. I don't think it was in this class when it happened, but when they put out that official apology from themselves to China, that was brilliant. That was brilliant. Are you familiar with that, guys? Should I dig it up somewhere on my phone and share it with you? I'll do that. Hopefully,
Yes,
or
please. Yeah,
because I
that was
don't know if there's a way of
fantastic.
actually sharing it in the chat box. Uh, or actually, yes, I can do this. I can just do a screen share um, of my Google screen here, and then do a little Googling. Uh, yeah, okay. Trey Parker official, South Park official apology, and you'll see that. So this was after this was when the NBA situation was happening, and with the comment made about China, about Hong Kong rather, and so this was the apology that Trey Parker and Matt Stone uh, uh, wrote on Twitter. Quote, like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy. She doesn't look just like Winnie the Pooh at all. Tune into our 300th episode this Wednesday at 10. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May this autumn sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China? Um, and I know that the episode